August 1942. The air thrummed with the roar of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, their sirens a prelude to destruction, a sound that had become synonymous with German victory. For Major Hans-Joachim Lange of the 71st Infantry Division, positioned on the sun-baked steppe overlooking the Volga, Stalingrad was little more than a smudge on the horizon, an obstacle soon to be swept aside. The city, a sprawling industrial hub, was named after the Soviet dictator, a symbolic prize. Lange, a seasoned officer who had witnessed the rapid collapse of French and early Soviet resistance, felt the familiar surge of confidence. His men, tired from the long march through the summer heat, were nonetheless eager. They'd heard the whispers from above. The Soviets were broken, their spirit shattered, their reserves depleted. This was to be the final decisive blow in the East. According to the Daily Situation report circulated among staff, the Red Army was on its last legs. But the vast smoking landscape ahead held a dark, silent promise of a struggle unlike any they had yet encountered. The initial thrust into Stalingrad was a blur of mechanized speed and overwhelming firepower. General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, supported by General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, had driven deep into Soviet territory, their advance seemingly unstoppable. German propaganda posters plastered across occupied zones depicted the hammer and sickle shattered under the heel of the Wehrmacht. High command communiques, seen by officers like Lange, painted a picture of rapid progress, stating unequivocally that Soviet resistance was disorganized and crumbling. Intelligence estimates, often filtered through the lens of early blitzkrieg successes, suggested minimal coordinated defense within the city itself. They expected a quick mop-up operation, perhaps a few days of street fighting against what were perceived as ill-equipped, poorly trained Asiatic hordes before securing the vital Volga crossings. In the war diary of the 24th Panzer Division, the entry for late August spoke of negligible resistance in the approach to the city, fostering a dangerous sense of complacency. The initial perception was clear: contempt, bordering on dismissive arrogance, for an enemy deemed inferior in every way. Yet, even in the first days of September, as German forward elements reached the city's fringes, cracks began to appear in this perception. The open steppe gave way to a labyrinth of brick and concrete. The battle for the grain elevator, a massive, towering structure, became one of the first brutal indicators that Stalingrad was different. Elements of the 295th Infantry Division found themselves locked in a savage, days-long struggle against Soviet defenders who fought for every floor, every silo. Radio logs intercepted by German units revealed frantic, often desperate Soviet calls for reinforcements, but never an order to retreat. Major Lange's own division, pushing towards the Central District, encountered fire not just from frontline positions, but from unexpected corners: cellars, ruined buildings, drainage pipes. Snipers, invisible and deadly, picked off officers and NCOs with chilling regularity. One company commander in Lange's battalion, in a hastily scribbled note to his wife, lamented the invisible enemy and the sheer volume of fanatical resistance. Confusion began to seep into the ranks. Why weren't they retreating? Why were they fighting so hard for mere rubble? The expected capitulation never came. Each building became a fortress, each street a battlefield, and the cost in German blood began to climb, raising the first uncomfortable questions amongst the German high command. As September bled into October, the scale and ferocity of the urban combat escalated beyond anything the German army had ever conceived. The battles for Mamayev Kurgan, the tractor factory, and the Red October industrial complex became legends of horrific attrition. These weren't mere objectives. They were meat grinders. The 71st Infantry Division, initially so confident, found itself fighting tooth and nail for square meters of shattered factory floor. In a report forwarded to Army Group B, a senior intelligence officer grimly observed that Soviet tactics involved relentless counterattacks, often suicidal, designed to inflict maximum casualties regardless of their own losses. The Germans, masters of maneuver warfare, were forced into a primitive, brutal form of combat known as Ratskrieg, rat war. Close quarters, room-to-room fighting with grenades, submachine guns, and bayonets became the norm. The War Diary of the Sixth Army began to record increasing instances of Soviet holdouts who would refuse to surrender even when surrounded, fighting to the last man. Captain Helmut Giebler, serving with a pioneer battalion, wrote home describing a foe who fights with the savagery of a cornered beast, emerging from the ruins when you least expect them. The confusion had given way to a grudging respect, tinged with growing fear. The German soldier, accustomed to the sight of fleeing Russians, was now confronted with an enemy who simply refused to yield, an enemy who seemed to thrive amidst the destruction. This shift in perception wasn't merely due to Soviet tenacity, it was also a direct consequence of their tactical ingenuity born of desperation. Under orders like, "Not one step back," Order Number 227, Soviet defenders, often composed of hastily trained recruits and penal battalions, used the ruined cityscape to their advantage. They transformed apartment blocks into fortified strongpoints, created sniper nests in ventilation shafts, and tunneled through cellars to launch surprise attacks behind German lines. They knew the terrain, and they had adapted. General Hans Dauer, Chief of Staff of the 4th Panzer Army, later reflected in his memoirs that the Soviets demonstrated a fanatical determination to hold every ruin, every cellar, every scrap of ground. This wasn't merely propaganda, it was an assessment based on bitter experience. German units, once able to cover miles in a day, now spent weeks fighting for a single building. The sheer scale of the resistance, the willingness of the Soviets to die for every meter, forced German commanders to rethink their entire understanding of their enemy. What they had once dismissed as primitive fanaticism, they now began to recognize as an unshakable will to resist, a deep-seated patriotism, or perhaps simply a primal instinct for survival fueled by Stalin's draconian orders. By late October and early November, as winter's icy grip tightened around Stalingrad, the perception among many German commanders had fully transformed. Respect had deepened into a chilling awe, bordering on fear. The Sixth Army was bleeding out, its strength slowly but surely eroding in the face of relentless Soviet defense. The constant street fighting, the lack of sleep, the perpetual danger from unseen snipers and desperate counterattacks took a terrible toll on morale. Major Lange, his face etched with fatigue, now understood. The Soviet soldier, once seen as an inferior, expendable pawn, was a formidable adversary, capable of enduring unimaginable suffering and fighting with a tenacity that defied rational explanation. In a letter to his family, dated November 8th, Lange described the fighting as infernal, a struggle for every stone, every breath. He recounted instances where wounded Soviets, rather than surrendering, would detonate grenades, taking Germans with them. The Germans, who had so easily swept through Europe, were now locked in a death struggle, bled dry by an enemy they had fundamentally underestimated. The War Diary of the 79th Infantry Division, a unit heavily engaged, stated bluntly, "The enemy's resistance shows no signs of weakening. Rather, it appears to grow more determined with each passing day." The initial contempt had morphed into a terrifying understanding. The Red Army in Stalingrad was not just fighting, it was sacrificing itself, one building, one soldier, one bullet at a time, to break the spine of the Wehrmacht. The belief in a swift, decisive victory had vanished, replaced by a grim realization that Stalingrad was not a battle for a city, but a battle for survival, a crucible that would define the fate of the Eastern Front. And as the snow began to fall, trapping the Sixth Army in a vast, deadly embrace, German commanders understood, with stark and terrifying clarity, that their enemy was far from broken. They were, in fact, unbreakable.